as we said, I just want to start and allow you to educate us all on who your background and you leading up into your time of getting into politics. So if you wouldn't mind giving us kind of a peek behind the curtain of your life and who you were and where you're from and what led you to politics, and then press pause there and we're going to roll from that point.
I'll give you the story. I was born and raised on a dairy farm in Central California. And when I was 16, I was in the barn milking cows, and next thing I knew, I was in bed in the house. My brother had picked me up and taken me to the house because I had just had a grand mal seizure. And the doctors came out and told my parents that it appeared that I had epilepsy. My parents, of Portuguese ancestry and Catholic and so forth, believed that if you had epilepsy, you were possessed by the devil. Now, I always say to my Republican friends, no, I'm possessed. But having your family think you're possessed is a little different. But they then started taking me to witch doctors. And I went to 3. The last one was the most interesting. And he said, put a raw egg under your arm, let it stay there for a half an hour. If it turns black, the evil spirits have left. Well, you know the answer, it didn't turn black. But that was the last one I went to. I said, no more witch doctors. And that started to erode the relationship between my family and I. And so then what happened is I kept on having, as I thought, passing out spells. Because the doctor at that age doesn't talk to the young person, they talk to the parents. So I didn't know anything that was going on. So I kept on having these passing out spells. I decided, as a result of my high school superintendent, to get out of town. I was raised in an area of about 200 people, and the local town was about 2,000. But felt that I should get out of town. So I went to Los Angeles and went to Loyola Marymount University, a Catholic college in Los Angeles. And I loved it. It was a tremendous challenge and so forth. And I decided I wanted to become a trial lawyer. Then John F. Kennedy got assassinated, and it hit me really hard. And I decided that instead of being a trial lawyer, I wanted to do something that really helped people. And so upon graduating, I decided I wanted to become a Catholic priest. So I go for my physical. The doctor says, have you ever heard the word epilepsy? I said, no. He said, describe what it is. And then he said, there's good news in that 1964, you're 4F, which means you're ineligible to join the military. The bad news is that in canon law in 400 AD, the Catholic Church amended canon law to say that if you have epilepsy or possessed by the devil, you can't be a priest. Now, I took that as positive from the point of view that I now knew what my passing out spells were, I could get medication for it, and so forth. I didn't take the negative priesthood. I was more interested in my being able to understand what was going on. So I called my mother after I got out of the doctor's office, and I was excited. I said, I know what my problem is. Doctor says I have epilepsy. My mother interrupted me and said, no son of ours has epilepsy. Now, I had no idea of all this background stuff, what they felt and so on. But that sort of, again, separated me more and more from my family. I was student vice president, outstanding senior, had a lot of job offers. And so I started going after these offers and filling out the job application. And on every job application was the word epilepsy. And I marked it. I never got one interview. And that hit me pretty hard because I thought I could work anywhere, but all of a sudden I couldn't get anything. I started drinking. I was drunk by 2 o'clock in the afternoon. I had lost all confidence in myself. I thought God had turned against me. I thought the church had turned against me. I thought my parents had turned against me. And I was lost. I became suicidal. On the day I was going to do the dirty deed, there was a merry-go-round on the bottom of this hill in Griffith Park in Los Angeles where I was going to do my thing. And I heard a voice, and the voice said, "You're going to be just like those kids on the bottom of this hill. You're never going to let anybody or anything stop you from doing what you want to do." And that was overpowering for me. I immediately got my mojo back. I've never been depressed. I've never been suicidal. I don't get drunk. I drink, but I don't get drunk. And all of a sudden, I felt positive about what I could do just because of that voice. And then in about 2 weeks, I had an opportunity to go live with Bob Hope and his family. Now, some of you are too old to know who Bob Hope is, but he was the outstanding comedian on TV and was quite famous and so forth. But I lived with him and his family. And one day we're on the way to the Bob Hope Chrysler Comedy Hour that we did. And he said to me, he said, "Tony, you think you have a ministry and you're struggling and what you can do with it. And a true ministry, a ministry can be practiced in sports, entertainment, business, etc., government. But where you belong is in politics." Now, Bob Hope was a very conservative Republican, and I'm not conservative or Republican. But I took his advice, and I immediately wrote a letter to my congressman who I didn't know. He happened to be looking for somebody young who had an agriculture background, and I got the job. And that started my career in politics. He became like my father. I would still have seizures. I've had seizures for 64 years. I still have seizures. But he totally accepted my seizures. And I could have a seizure in front of him, and he would tell people, "Just calm down. He'll be fine once the seizure is over." So it was a tremendous, wonderful experience. And I did that for 13 years. I became his chief of staff. And when he retired, he wanted me to run in his place. And I easily got elected. And during that campaign, my opponent said one night at a dinner that, I don't know if you know it or not, but Tony's a sick man. He has epilepsy. And what would you think if he went to the White House to argue a critical issue for us, and that area is water, to argue a critical issue for us and had a seizure? And some of the people at that dinner were very upset, called me and told me what he said. And I get a call the next day from the reporter and says, "I understand your opponent said, blah, blah, blah. What's your reaction?" And the good Lord was with me because I said, "You know, in the 13 years I was a staffer in Congress, I knew a lot of people who went to the White House and had fits. At least I'd have an excuse." That killed that one. That never been a problem. So that's how I got there. That's how I got involved. And the only other thing I'll say before you take over is that when I was a staffer and then as a member, I internalized all I had gone through as a youngster. And I knew it was wrong to discriminate against people who have a disability. And I felt strongly about what should be done about that. And I tried to get my boss to offer amendments, and he was happy to. But we didn't have our basic civil rights in, so there was no way you could amend a law to take care of those of us with disabilities, which was shocking to me. And so when I got elected to Congress, I decided that that was going to be one of my goals, was to try to do something to turn things around. And I'll keep on going just a bit more. And one day I got a call from a woman that I've known a long time from Denver, Colorado, and her husband and I were good friends. And she came over, and she and another woman came over and met with me, and they were chair and vice chair of the Disability Council for President Reagan. And they both had children with disabilities, and they wanted to get me to help solve that problem. So that's how I got started in the whole movement.
Beautiful. Thank you for sharing that. One thing, and not so people leave here and go look up things on you, but there are some powerful videos of you testifying, whether it's there at the Capitol or that you can just find on YouTube. And I found it fascinating as I was watching that, in the way that you just did it and telling the story, you were able to say we, and you were able to talk about you being someone that had a disability. How important do you think that was once you were elected and you took off and you were entering some choppy waters, and I think I was talking to you earlier, you made a lot of enemies, and that was a very hard thing to navigate in introducing the ADA. Can you talk about to us a little bit the importance and the impact that it had, that you could speak from the place of those that you were trying to help?
Well, I think that it was interesting when I was going to put in the legislation, you do a letter to your colleagues and say, I'm putting in X bill for X reason, would like your support. And people would come up to you, men and women in Congress in front of me, Republicans and Democrats, and say, you know, I like what you said in your letter, because I don't like the way my husband, my wife, my next door neighbor, my child, whatever, way they're treated because of their disability. And so I want to be on your bill. Now, most of them hadn't even read my letter, let alone know what's in the bill. But they reacted just because of the issue. And so on that first introduction, I had about 120 different co-sponsors, Democrats and Republicans. And that's how it all started, is that people, because in the letter I acknowledged that I have epilepsy, and I acknowledged some of the things that I've been through and that how unfair it was. And just one quick story, when I testified on the Senate side, I went through my story, and after it was over with, Ted Kennedy was the chair of that committee. The Republican lead on that committee was an individual by the name of Orrin Hatch, a Republican from Utah. And Ted Kennedy said a question. He said, Orrin, do you want to say something? And Hatch was absolutely wonderful. He said, Tony, I just want you to know, as a Mormon in my church, you're a child of God. I'll help you whenever you want to be. And he was fabulous, a conservative Republican, basically the voice of the Republicans, conservative Republicans. Had Bob Dole, who was the majority leader in the Senate. You had Ted Kennedy, who was the Democratic leader, and you had Tom Harkin, whose brother was here in here. So it was a dynamite crowd, but it was a great event and was impactful on me, let alone the people in the room.
Sure. Well, and I know, and I appreciate you sharing that. And in the video, one thing that stood out to me, and I'm going to really get into like more your pedagogy and just your general philosophy here. You used a line, and I'm not quoting you exactly, paraphrasing. They were asking for these things and these rights, but you essentially said allows the ability to fail. I'm not asking for everything to be perfect and handed to some, but just give us the chance to have an opportunity to fail and to learn. And that resonated so strongly with me, because I'm not asking for a handout, I want a chance. And with chances come the ability that you might fail, but when you fail, you learn. So can you expand on that a little bit?
Yeah, there's another part to that. I always say, if you give me a chance to fail, then I have an opportunity to succeed.
Mm-hmm.
But if you don't give me a chance to fail, I can never succeed. And that was my whole pitch, is that some people say, well, if we hire you, then we can't fire you. Yes, you can. If we can't do the job, fire us. I'm not trying to have a situation where people have to keep you on just because you have a disability. That's not what it's about. And so it's something I've used all the time about giving the chance to fail. And I think it's very appropriate, because people have a tendency to think that we want a handout. We don't want a handout. We want an opportunity. And if you give us that opportunity, we can succeed.
And I appreciate you sharing that. That was just one of the few things that as I was listening to you talk, I could tell you were very convicted by that message. And so I wanted to allow you to share on that. It's great timing here with obviously being Disability Pride Month, but also we are, I guess, 7 days away from the 34th anniversary of the ADA going into effect.
35th.
35th, I'm sorry, bad math. I'm at work in the cyber school and I don't know math. Our kids do calculus as freshmen and I can't add 30. But anyways, I digress. So 35 years, as you, and we'll step forward for a second, as you look back at that now, what are, over those 35 years, there's a lot to be proud of, but what are some things that you have really seen come to fruition or things that have evolved throughout that 35 years that you remain very proud of and appreciate the growth of with the ADA?
I think the one thing, there's a lot of things that have happened, I think they're important, but the one thing that I have found that as a result of the United States adopting the ADA, that we now have over 50 different countries throughout the world who have their ADA. It's not exactly like ours, but it's basically a recognition that people with disabilities should have some rights and so forth. That to me is extremely significant. We export a lot of stuff. Some of it good, some of it bad. But exporting the right of people with disabilities is very satisfying to me that has happened all over the world. As I was, after we got the ADA, and I've traveled the world trying to convince other countries to adopt it. And some of the things that I saw, I don't mind saying that I went to Portugal, because I'm Portuguese, as I say. And I said to the president who was close to me, I understood that they had places where only people with disabilities were allowed. And so I said to him that I want to go to this particular place. He said, no, you can't. I said, why? He said, because we've got a program. And I said, I know what's going on. I want to go. And he finally said, okay. I walked in the door, and it was atrocious. People crawling around on the floor in their own feces and just struggling. And I was embarrassed as heck. And I went back to the president and said, as a Portuguese American, I can't believe that Portugal would do what they're doing. And that changed. The other story that I'll say on that I've always been very proud of is that when I became the majority whip in the House of Representatives, I had an opportunity to take a delegation and travel. And so, of course, the first place you take Democrats and Republicans in the delegation. And so the first place I want to go to, of course, is Portugal. And so, it's red carpet, and dinner, you speak to the parliament, and all that stuff. The second place, the State Department wanted me to go to Morocco and meet with the king, because they were, Portugal and Morocco were working on some issues for the Middle East, and the State Department wanted to convey some thoughts, which I was fine with. The third country I got to choose, and I said I want to go to the Vatican and meet with Pope John Paul. And they arranged it. And so my group ends up at the Vatican, and the Pope walks in, we stand up, he sits down, everybody sits down, and now it's my turn to say something. And I take the view very strongly that when you have the podium, and it doesn't have to be a steel thing or what thing, just when you have control of an audience, that's the podium. When you have a podium, you should speak the truth. And so the State Department and the Vatican had pre-approved speeches for me and for the Pope. And so after I got through reading this very boring speech, I said, Your Holiness, I could not live with myself if I would say something personal. Well, his minions around the room, I could hear them going, that's just uncalled for. You're not supposed to do that. My delegation looked at me as if I was crazy. And I said, as a young man, I decided I want to become a Catholic priest. I was denied entry because I have epilepsy, and canon law in 400 AD established that people with epilepsy are possessed by the devil, can't be a priest. I think that's very unchristian of our church, and I wish you'd look into it. After he then gave his very boring speech, we then took a lot of pictures, and then we're ready to leave. And so he ends up walking to the door with myself and my wife, holding her hand. We get to the door, and we bless him. He does not bless me. If you're a Catholic and the Pope doesn't bless you, you're going straight to hell. They did not bless him. What he said was, "Young man, I heard your comments." He turned around and walked away. Now, I didn't tell that story for a long time because I really felt that when he turned around and didn't bless me, that it was a negative. 2 years after that visit, canon law was changed to prevent people with epilepsy to become priests. Now, I want to be very careful. I say this all the time. I mean it in Muslim service. I do not know if my comments are the thing that made it happen. I just don't. Vatican never got in touch with me at all, and so, but I just know it happened, and that's exciting. And I don't mind telling the story because I believe in speaking truth to power, and I'm not afraid to speak up when I think something's wrong. I've done it to presidents, I do it to whoever, and as he said, I've made some enemies in the process by doing it. But I feel strongly that if you feel strongly about something, you should say it.
Yeah, and you've done that across multiple administrations, which I also find interesting from, and you mentioned the Kennedy, but going back and then stretching all the way as to most recently things with Biden and so I find that fascinating that you've been involved in the space for that long and served through so many different presidents and leaders and administrations. What has allowed you to remain so steadfast and so present in that space amongst all of the change? Because I'm sure everyone here that they're versing in politics with those rooms and those people change so often. It's such a revolving door, but you have stayed there as a stable in this space. And how have you been able to do that?
Well, I'm as involved today as I've ever been in regards to disability. It's my passion, it's my ministry. But I think the reason is when you go through suicide and you come out of it, you're very strong about who you are. You're very strong in believing who you are. And so I don't mind standing up for what I believe in, because I've been there on the other side. And so people can't stop me from saying what I strongly believe if I think you're wrong. And doesn't mean I'm right, it's just that I think that way. And so I don't mind people telling me I'm wrong, but I feel strongly that you need to speak to power. And so I've done that all my years. But again, I go back to the fact that if any of you have ever gone through suicide or think about it or whatever, you know what I mean when you come out of it. You are ready to take on the world. You just believe strongly in who you are and so forth.
Great, well, thank you. And that's something that also touches me on a very personal level. But I would like, in this setting, and I know you spend time with people outside, and I'm going to selfishly ask you to let us behind the curtain maybe a little bit without using any names or creating any, trying to create retroactively any feelings. But maybe some of the could you share a story or two of some of the bigger challenges you faced when, and we're going back to the bill being drafted and proposing, so I'm kind of pressing rewind here. But would you mind sharing a story or two of kind of the behind the curtain, behind the scenes of something that might have been a roadblock along the way, or was a really hard challenge as you were getting into getting this thing to come to life?
Well, when I put it in the bill, it was at the end of the Congress, and that's when I got all those signatures. And so then the next Congress, what we did, we worked with the Senate and the White House, both Democrats and Republicans, to try to come up with a bill that everybody could support. And then in May of that year, I put in the legislation that then eventually become law. In June, on my birthday, I left the Congress. And I don't mind saying I left the Congress because the Washington Post had accused me of taking campaign funds and buying a bond with that. Just not true. But in politics, you got to be prepared for the slings and arrows that come your way. At that particular time, Jim Wright was in trouble politically. There was a lot of turmoil going on. And I'd been campaign chair for 6 years and getting people to run for Congress and working on messaging and so forth. And I decided that I wasn't going to go through that. And so I left the Congress. It was not a tough decision. I thought that I was doing the right thing by leaving. And then I decided, ultimately I got several offers and I went to Wall Street and worked on Wall Street for several years. But going through that experience again is, it builds a little scar tissue on it. But that's what happens, and so you gotta be prepared for it. Some of the things that happened when we were trying to do the ADA was that Greyhound bus fought the ADA harder than anyone. And what they said was that the buses could not be made accessible to the elderly or people in wheelchairs and so forth. And my attitude was, look, once this becomes law, you're going to have people and companies decide how to make your buses accessible. And we gave them, I think it was 15 years to let that happen. And nowadays, if you see these buses and so forth, they bow and scrape and guy called dance and so forth. And the technology is there to permit people to use it. But ADA, we had a phrase in there that economically feasible, never been used in law before, but economically feasible. If you're McDonald's hamburgers, you can afford any accommodation that should be required. But if you're mom and pop pizza shop, that economically feasible is a problem. Well, you can get a piece of 2x4 and plywood and make a ramp. That's economically feasible. That's what we meant. We don't want to it doesn't make any sense for us to put a business out of business when I'm trying to create opportunity for people to work. So that's why that language is in there, is it's encourage businesses to provide for accommodation instead of challenging them and in effect having them go out of business. That doesn't make any sense for us. The other thing that happened, quick on, is that when I put it in, the Speaker of the House at that time, Tom Coelho, I was majority leader. Tom Coelho said to me, that bill is way too big. It's too massive and so forth. You need to break it up in parts and offer it in several parts. Now, he was elected by the Democratic caucus. I was the majority whip. I was elected by the Democratic caucus. So I thought I had as much influence or power as he did. So I said no. And we put it in as it was, and it passed as it was. But those are some of the hurdles that we faced. And I don't think any of it was because they were negative to those of us with disabilities. I think it had a lot to do with lack of experience. For example, the Supreme Court, when the ADA got up to that level after challenges, 10 years after we adopted it, the Supremes, as I call them, decided that the ADA only covered physical disabilities. It didn't cover intellectual disabilities or anything else. And that, I have epilepsy, as I've told you, and I was the pusher on that legislation. I testified talking about my epilepsy. Everybody knew that was the part of the reason for the ADA. But the Supreme Court decided otherwise. And then what we did is we then introduced the ADA Amendments Act. That said, Mr. Supremes, you're wrong. The ADA does cover all disabilities. So we repealed a Supreme Court decision, which isn't too easy to do, but it got past the House and Senate overwhelmingly. So these are some of the struggles that we've gone through. I can go through a lot of others, but those are some of them. People were kindly negative, but really not. But they would say nice things and say why they were opposed. But we faced it. In the Senate, we only lost 3 votes out of 100. In the House, we lost several more. But what was great about it was bipartisan. I love that. Today, you won't get many bipartisan things happen, but in those days, we can make that.
Thank you for sharing that. And my last question before I turn it over to the audience to ask questions for you is, what are one or what multitude of issues that exist today that kind of keep you up at night? What are the things that, we talked about what we're driving 30, 35 years ago, maybe even a little bit after that. What is it today? Are there particular things that in July of 2025 that keep you up at night, that keep you going, that keep you moving forward with this?
Well, I think that there are 2 things. First off is that the ADA is a civil rights act, which means it has to be enforced. Nothing else, you can't do it. And so I always tell people, when you vote, make sure you realize that when you vote for the president, you're voting for him or her to appoint the Attorney General, who then appoints the head of the Civil Rights Division, that then has the responsibility to enforce civil rights law. So it starts at the top. And if you don't get the right head of the Civil Rights Division, the ADA is not enforced. People can do anything they want, and it's not enforced. So that's the one thing I worry about a lot is there going to be changes on the current climate? Are they going to go after the ADA? I worry about that. And secondly, the thing that troubles me a lot, well, 2 things. And this may be troublesome to some folks. And that is that I really regret that we weren't able to put churches under the ADA. If we had, we would have lost the bill. We would have got it. But as a Catholic, there are a lot of churches that have these wonderful, beautiful steps that a lot of people with disabilities can't enter. Some of them are putting in ramps now because people have complained. But and a lot of churches still preach different cultures, possession of the devil, and that's wrong. It's just totally wrong, and it not only destroys the individual, it destroys the family. And so I wish there was a way to turn that around. There isn't. And the next thing is jobs. We only have about 25–30% of those of us with disabilities who are employed. A job is critically important for everybody. It gives you your independence, it gives you your pride, it gives you opportunities to do things. And without it, you don't have any of that. People who, I hope you don't mind, this individual I was talking to, and I loved him in his story. He got recently paralyzed, and he's now married with a child, has a job, and I think it's wonderful. I love it. I just think it's so good that happens. But just think, if he couldn't get a job, what that would be to his family if he may or may not have gotten married. Wouldn't be able to provide for the family, and so forth. And I can tell you all kinds of stories as I travel the country of people with disabilities who get married and have a family, but they got a job, and they're thankful to me for creating that. And, you know, I still think that, I maybe not got into priesthood, but I am a priest. And that helping people get those jobs, being positive about people who get a job and can have a family and are successful, and so forth. That to me is what it's all about. So I thank you for your story.
Wonderful. Thank you, and I echo that as well. So what we're going to do now is I'm going to